There is something obscene about usefulness. Society worships it like a god, sacrifices to it, kneels before it, and calls it progress. The modern human does not wake. He boots up. He doesn't live. He performs. Every moment is measured by output. Every silence is an error. Every breath must justify itself. To do nothing has become the last sin. Yet that is precisely why doing nothing might be the last sacred act left. We have built an empire of motion, a cult of efficiency. Everything that exists must prove its purpose. The planet must be productive. The body must be optimized. Even leisure must be monetized. The modern man no longer rests. He recovers, only to continue performing. He believes stillness is death because he has forgotten how to exist without justification. He must always be becoming, never simply being. But what if the true revolt is to stop? Not to die, not to destroy, but to simply refuse to participate in the machinery of meaning. To live without purpose in a world that worships it is the most violent act of resistance imaginable. Because when you stop producing, you stop feeding the god of utility. You step out of the assembly line of identity. You become ungovernable. Philosophers have always known this secret, though most were too afraid to say it. The ancients hid it behind mysticism. The moderns disguised it as despair. Kioran whispered it through sarcasm. Schopenhauer wrapped it in metaphysics. The Buddhists turned it into enlightenment. The useless life is the only free one. Because usefulness is a chain disguised as virtue. It ties your worth to what you can offer until you no longer exist without a function. We call this progress, but it's slavery refined to perfection. The slave of the ancient world knew he was owned. The modern slave believes he's employed. He sells his time, his thoughts, his peace, not for survival, but for validation. He must always be improving himself, always optimizing. He is both product and producer. His exhaustion is his pride. His silence is his guilt. To stop is to betray the whole system. To pause is to terrify it. A man doing nothing cannot be predicted, cannot be marketed, cannot be measured. He becomes invisible to the gods of productivity. He ceases to be a cog and becomes something ancient again, a being. And that is the greatest blasphemy of all. This is not laziness. Laziness is still part of the machine. It defines itself against work. True uselessness has no opposite. It is not rebellion for the sake of drama. It is the quiet refusal to justify one's existence. It is the art of saying no to the tyranny of becoming. It is silence as defiance. The ancients understood this, even if they didn't have the language for it. The cynics, the hermits, the monks, they all revolted against purpose by retreating from it. They lived without explanation. They understood that to live without a why is to be beyond control. Once you stop needing a reason to exist, you cannot be ruled. You are outside the economy of fear. That's why the modern world fears idleness more than death. Death, at least, can be productive. It feeds industries, memorials, rituals. But idleness produces nothing. It is sterile in the eyes of progress. It mocks the logic of capitalism, which survives by convincing you that your time belongs to it. The useless man is terrifying because he cannot be bought. Every civilization tries to domesticate the useless. Religion promises eternal reward for obedience. Science promises progress for labor. Psychology promises self-fulfillment through productivity. Even rebellion has been monetized. Every anti-system voice is soon turned into a brand. But uselessness escapes all of it. It cannot be advertised because it cannot be sold. In this sense, the act of doing nothing is not nihilism. It is a sacred pause. It is the moment when you stop answering to the world's demand for justification and realize that life existed before meaning. You existed before names, before goals, before measurement. That is the sacred uselessness of life. The space before purpose corrupts existence. We have forgotten that the universe itself is useless. It has no purpose, no goal, no destination. It expands for no reason. Stars explode not to enlighten us, but because they must. Nature is pure waste, extravagant, chaotic, indifferent. And yet, we call it beautiful. Why? Because it exists without needing to prove itself. The flower that blooms and dies unseen is the purest philosopher. The cloud that drifts without purpose is freer than all mankind. To call something useless is an insult only in a culture that has replaced being with doing. The Greeks knew that the highest life, the bios theoretikos, was contemplative, not productive. Leisure was divine. To work constantly was servile. But somewhere between the Industrial Revolution and the digital one, we lost that sacred idleness. We turned rest into recovery, reflection into content, existence into service. And now we are haunted by our own acceleration. We cannot stop because we've built an identity around motion. What do you do has replaced who are you as the question that defines a human being. And if you dare to answer nothing, you become a ghost, invisible, irrelevant, suspect. But maybe that ghost is the only free creature left. To do nothing is not to abandon life, it is to reclaim it from purpose. It is to realize that the world's obsession with productivity is a fear of death disguised as virtue. We work, we strive, we plan, because we cannot face the stillness at the center of existence. The silence terrifies us because it reminds us that life doesn't need us. It never did. The universe would continue just fine without our noise. And yet, that silence is not emptiness, it's freedom. It is the one space where power cannot follow. Governments can tax income, corporations can monetize attention, religions can sanctify suffering, but no one can measure nothingness. Doing nothing is an act beyond surveillance. It is the last form of privacy. So what happens when a person stops? When he no longer participates, no longer competes, no longer performs? The world reacts violently. It calls him lazy, lost, insane. It tries to cure him. Because if one person escapes the cult of usefulness, others might follow. And if too many people stop, the machine stalls. Society depends on perpetual activity to hide its emptiness. Doing nothing is a mirror held to that emptiness. It shows the system its own absurdity. It reveals that all our striving, all our goals, all our endless plans are built on sand. That beneath every ideology of purpose lies a single, unspoken truth. Life has none. And that truth, once seen, is unbearable, unless you learn to love it. Comment below. Do you think purpose gives life meaning or steals it? Subscribe for more forbidden philosophy, ideas that challenge the cult of usefulness. Like this if you've ever felt the world is terrified of silence. Share this with someone who needs to stop running. Because maybe the only true rebellion left is to do nothing at all. Modern civilization has turned time into a weapon. Once, it was a flow. Now it's a grid. Once it was sacred, now it's monetized. You are born into debt, not only financial, but existential. You owe the world an explanation for your existence. You owe your parents' success, your teacher's achievement, your society contribution. Even your rest must be productive. Recharge, they say, as if stillness were only valuable when it serves motion. The calendar, the clock, the schedule, they are not neutral inventions. They are instruments of obedience. They carve eternity into pieces small enough to sell. The hours of your life become currency. The system doesn't steal your time. It convinces you to give it away willingly. You trade your days for a wage, your attention for entertainment, your peace for relevance. You spend your life proving your worth to a world that cannot define it. In this economy of meaning, even rebellion is absorbed. Every movement, every ideology, every critique becomes part of the same rhythm of productivity. Activism, self-improvement, spirituality, all get converted into forms of labor. The machine doesn't care what side you're on as long as you keep moving. The true heretic is not the revolutionary who fights, but the one who refuses to play. That's the paradox of the age. You can say anything, believe anything, buy anything, except nothing. Nothing cannot be marketed. Nothing cannot be taxed. Nothing cannot be measured. That's why it is the only true space of freedom left. The ability to exist without producing, without performing, without explaining, is the ultimate act of sovereignty. But the machine has learned to disguise its control as care. It tells you to find purpose, as if purpose were liberation. It tells you to chase your dreams, follow your passion, make an impact. It sells you transcendence through labor. And so you spend your life in self-imposed servitude, believing you are free because you chose your chains. The illusion is perfect. You are the entrepreneur of your own captivity. Foucault might have called this the discipline of desire. Power no longer commands, it seduces. It makes you want to serve. You perform not out of fear, but devotion. The modern citizen is no longer a slave. He's a volunteer. He measures his worth through productivity, his identity through performance. His exhaustion is his proof of existence. Even the body has become an instrument of labor. Health is no longer a state, it's a project. Every step counted, every calorie tracked, every heartbeat monitored, all in the name of optimization. The body becomes an investment portfolio, the soul a startup. Rest becomes failure. Silence becomes guilt. We have turned self-care into another industry of productivity. And when people break under the weight of it all, society doesn't ask why. It offers therapy to fix them, medication to restore them, motivation to reinsert them. The problem is never the machine. It's the gear that stopped turning. Depression, anxiety, burnout, all are treated as malfunctions of the individual, not symptoms of a culture addicted to motion. But the truth is simpler and darker. The system is functioning exactly as designed. It doesn't want peace, it wants continuity. It doesn't want happiness, it wants engagement. It doesn't need your soul, only your attention. And the easiest way to control someone is to keep them busy. Motion becomes distraction, and distraction becomes ideology. That's why the sacred uselessness of life is so dangerous. Because once you stop moving, you start seeing. You begin to notice the architecture of control hidden behind the noise of purpose. You realize that most of your ambitions were never yours. They were planted in you by a system that needs your perpetual motion to survive. To stop is to expose. When you stop doing, the illusion collapses. You see that the world's meaning is not intrinsic, it's manufactured. You see that productivity is not virtue, it's survival theater. You see that all your striving has been a desperate attempt to silence the terror of existing without reason. That terror is the raw truth of consciousness, the awareness that life has no goal, and that meaning is a story we tell to keep from screaming. But here's the paradox. The moment you stop running from that nothingness, it stops being terrifying. It becomes holy. That's what mystics, nihilists, and sages have always known. The void is not your enemy. It's your mirror. It's the only thing in existence that can't be commodified, politicized, or explained. When you sit in silence, doing nothing, the world's illusions begin to dissolve. You see that purpose was always the distraction. And yet most people can't stand that silence. They need purpose like a drug. They fear boredom because boredom is the glimpse of freedom. The unstructured moment exposes the emptiness beneath their activity. So they fill every gap with noise, with movement, with scrolling, with goals. Anything but stillness. Because stillness reveals the horror. The machine doesn't need to keep running. It just does. But uselessness doesn't mean withdrawal from life. It means entering it without the obsession to shape it. It means being present without performing presence. It's the art of existence without agenda. The ability to see beauty without wanting to use it. To live without function is to live without fear. Because the moment you stop trying to justify your life, no one can take it from you. Think of the useless beings in the world: the poet, the monk, the wanderer, the old man on a park bench. They are dismissed as unproductive, irrelevant, idle, but they are the only ones truly free. They have stepped outside the marketplace of purpose. Their time belongs to no one. Their thoughts have no buyer. Their silence has no audience. And in that uselessness, there is a dignity that the busy will never know. The sacred uselessness of life is not apathy. It's awareness. It's the moment when you see the absurdity of the world's demands and refuse to submit to them. It's not rebellion through destruction, but through absence. You no longer play the game of meaning, and therefore you cannot lose. That's why the powerful hate stillness, because it cannot be defeated. Even philosophy at its best is an act of uselessness. It produces nothing, sells nothing, solves nothing. And yet it's the only activity that dares to question why anything should be done at all. Philosophy is what remains when all utility has been stripped away. It's thought for its own sake, an act of defiance against the tyranny of purpose. To think without agenda is to be free from both hope and despair. But that's not how philosophy is treated now. It's been tamed, institutionalized, professionalized. The philosopher has become a specialist, a producer of knowledge. Even the study of uselessness must justify itself in publications and citations. The system has turned contemplation into labor, thought into commodity. And the more we chase intellectual relevance, the further we drift from wisdom. To rediscover the sacred uselessness of life is to unlearn this obsession. It's to realize that thought, like existence, doesn't need an outcome. It's to embrace the futility of being as a form of liberation. Because if nothing has meaning, then everything is possible. If life is useless, then it can finally be lived. Comment below. Do you think meaning is a human invention or something deeper? Subscribe if you believe philosophy should be dangerous again. Like this if you've ever felt that the world's noise is just fear in disguise. Share this with someone who's forgotten how to be still. Because to stop is not to surrender. It's to finally wake up. Morality was born the day someone called work good. Before that, existence was simply existence, hunger, survival, repetition. But once work became a virtue, slavery became holy. The act of serving others, of producing, of striving, was sanctified. Humanity internalized the whip. The masters no longer needed to punish, the people punished themselves for resting. Every civilization since has built its temples on this lie. That doing is better than being. The moralization of productivity is the greatest success of power. It has convinced even the oppressed that their worth depends on contribution. The worker exhausts himself and calls it dignity. The artist produces endlessly and calls it expression. The thinker writes compulsively and calls it relevance. Everyone is enslaved by the invisible demand to be useful, to justify their place in the world. And yet if you look closely, this obsession with usefulness hides terror. The terror of meaninglessness. The world doesn't ask you to be productive because it needs your work. It asks because it needs distraction. The more you produce, the less you think. The more you move, the less you feel the weight of the void. Society runs on fear disguised as purpose. Foucault once said that power doesn't repress desire, it organizes it. The same is true of morality. The system doesn't forbid you to rest, it defines rest as waste. It doesn't stop you from doing nothing. It makes nothingness shameful. You learn early that stillness is suspicious. The child who stares out the window too long is scolded. The teenager who drifts is called lazy. The adult who withdraws is pathologized. To be unproductive is to become a problem. But what if the problem is the world itself? What if the pathology lies in motion, not in stillness? What if all this relentless activity is a symptom of sickness, the sickness of a species that can't sit with itself? Sioran called this sickness the obsession with salvation. He meant that humanity cannot accept uselessness. Every culture invents a reason to exist, a god, a future, a mission, just to escape the absurd. We must justify ourselves, he wrote, or perish of self-contempt. And yet every justification decays into routine, into dogma, into noise. The cure to meaning is not more meaning, it's surrender. To embrace uselessness is to accept that life needs no justification. It's to understand that the void is not absence, it's truth. Every religion, every ideology, every self-help manual is an attempt to domesticate the void, to give it a name, to make it safe. But the void cannot be tamed. It is the source of all creation and destruction, of thought and silence, of birth and decay. To sit quietly within it is to be closer to reality than all the philosophers who ever wrote. But this terrifies people, because to accept the sacred uselessness of life is to lose identity. Who are you, if not what you do? Who are you, if not your goals, your achievements, your failures? If you remove the scaffolding of purpose, you fall into yourself, and there is nothing solid there. Just movement, sensation, decay. That's the truth we've been hiding from since the beginning of time. That the self is not a thing, but a rhythm. Yet that rhythm doesn't need to be useful. It doesn't need to be justified. The ocean doesn't apologize for its tides. The wind doesn't explain its direction. Life is not an argument. It's an accident. The more you try to justify it, the further you drift from it. The man obsessed with purpose spends his life in exile from existence. He becomes a worker in the factory of illusion, producing goals that dissolve on contact with time. The sacred uselessness of life is not nihilism in the sense of despair. It's clarity. It's the moment when you see that meaning is optional and you stop being its slave. You can still act, still create, still love, but not because it matters. You do it because you exist. The flower blooms not to prove a point, but because the sun exists. You are no different. To act without meaning is the highest form of freedom. That's what Nietzsche meant when he spoke of becoming who you are. Not finding a purpose, but shedding all the purposes you were given. To become who you are is to become useless in the eyes of the world. It's to live beyond justification, beyond morality, beyond reward. It's to live like art, beautiful, temporary, unnecessary. But modern man cannot stand useless beauty. He must explain it, monetize it, turn it into content. He must turn even contemplation into labor. He reads philosophy to be productive, meditates to increase focus, travels to gain perspective. Every experience must feed the machine of self-improvement. Even the search for peace becomes exhausting. The sacred uselessness of life rejects all of that. It says, stop improving, stop becoming, stop performing. There is no better version of you waiting to emerge. There is only you, breathing, decaying, aware. That awareness is enough. It is sacred not because it achieves anything, but because it doesn't have to. Society will call this nihilism, or failure, or insanity, because it cannot imagine a human being without a purpose. But the truth is that purpose is the most effective leash ever invented. Once you believe you exist for something, you will endure anything. You will obey any system that promises meaning. That's why every ideology begins with a story of destiny, to turn chaos into obligation. But what if we could learn to love chaos instead? What if we could learn to float in it without asking it to carry us somewhere? That is what doing nothing truly means. It's not idleness, it's intimacy with reality. It's the discipline of being instead of becoming. The revolution is not to change the world, but to stop mistaking change for life. When you understand that, something strange happens. Guilt dies. You stop apologizing for existing. You stop needing to prove yourself. You stop fearing failure because there's nothing left to fail at. Life ceases to be a project and becomes an experience. You don't own it. You witness it. That's the true meaning of uselessness, not waste, but wonder. Look at a child before the world teaches it to strive. It plays for no reason. It stares at nothing. It is completely absorbed in the present. That's not ignorance. That's enlightenment. The child lives in the sacred uselessness of life without knowing it. Then we ruin it. We teach it to compete, to plan, to achieve. We turn joy into duty, being into performance. And the tragedy is that the child grows up believing this is maturity. But perhaps maturity is the opposite, not the death of play but its return. The rediscovery of useless joy. The moment when you stop asking, "What is this for?" and simply live. The philosophers who reached that point, Lao Tzu, Epicurus, Sioran, even Nietzsche in his madness, all said the same thing in different words. Freedom begins when you stop chasing meaning. The modern world cannot understand this because it confuses meaning with truth. But truth needs no meaning to exist. The sun doesn't need to know why it shines. The truth simply is. The sacred uselessness of life is truth in its purest form, unfiltered, unnecessary, and unstoppable. Comment below. Do you think uselessness is liberation or escape? Subscribe if you want to see philosophy that defies every command to be productive. Like this if you've ever felt guilt for doing nothing, and saw for a moment how holy that felt. Share this with someone who's still chasing purpose like a ghost. Because perhaps the only sin left is usefulness. There is a moment, somewhere beyond exhaustion and rebellion, when you realize that all of existence is theater. Not a tragedy, not a comedy, just movement. Every purpose, every cause, every struggle is part of the same choreography, the dance of becoming. And you, sitting silently, finally see it for what it is, not as something to escape, but as something that never needed justification. Doing nothing isn't apathy. It's awareness freed from purpose. It's the stillness that comes after every illusion has burned away, when you no longer crave improvement or immortality. You begin to see that the world has always been complete, that nothing was ever missing except your willingness to stop looking for more. That's the secret of uselessness. It reveals that nothing is broken. You don't need to be fixed. The universe doesn't need a goal. Time doesn't need to be productive. All of it, the striving, the despair, the victories, the failures, is just the play of forces, beautiful and meaningless. The tragedy is not that life ends, but that we keep trying to make it mean something before it does. Once you understand this, peace becomes strange. Not the peace of comfort, but the peace of surrender. The kind that comes when you no longer bargain with reality. You stop asking for justice, for reward, for purpose. You no longer measure life in outcomes. You simply watch, and in that watching, everything becomes sacred again. This is what mystics meant when they spoke of enlightenment, not light, but clarity. The end of interpretation, the death of usefulness, the return to the raw pulse of existence. For the enlightened, nothing is wasted because nothing was ever required. They don't transcend life, they dissolve into it. They stop trying to win the game because they see there never was one. To live in this way is not to withdraw from the world, but to stop worshiping its noise. You can still work, still create, still speak, but now it's play, not performance. You no longer act out of fear or ambition, but out of spontaneity. You create, because creation is what being does. You rest because existence doesn't owe anyone an explanation. And that's what terrifies systems of power. The person who acts without needing a reason. You can't bribe him, can't manipulate him, can't recruit him. He is immune to both punishment and reward. He doesn't care if history remembers him. He doesn't need to win. He is the philosopher the state cannot use, the worker the market cannot enslave, the believer no religion can claim. He is useless, and therefore, untouchable. Society runs on the logic of exchange. Time for money, effort for reward, obedience for safety. Doing nothing collapses that economy. It introduces a kind of stillness that can't be measured, a wealth that can't be traded. The useless man carries no product. He produces nothing but presence. And presence in a world addicted to distraction, is heresy. That's why the world despises the contemplative. It needs him to look sick, aimless, pathetic, anything but free. Because if his uselessness ever looked beautiful, others might imitate it. If stillness ever looked strong, the machine would slow. And so, the contemplative is exiled, laughed at, medicated, pitied. Yet secretly, everyone envies him. They envy the one who no longer needs validation to exist. The sacred uselessness of life is not retreat, but refusal. A refusal to define yourself through motion, achievement, or purpose. It is an act of love toward existence itself, stripped of all conditions. It's saying to the world, you don't have to mean anything for me to love you. That's the highest form of rebellion, and the purest form of faith. Because in that useless love everything becomes equal. The sun and the trash heap, the genius and the fool, the newborn and the dying, all part of the same indifferent perfection. The universe wastes nothing because it never meant to use anything. It simply unfolds. To live uselessly is to live in harmony with that unfolding. But this way of seeing comes at a cost. Once you grasp the sacred uselessness of life, you can never fully return to society's illusions. You'll still play its games, but lightly. You'll still work, but without worship. You'll still dream, but you'll know the dream is not real. You'll speak the language of purpose because silence frightens people. But in your heart, you'll know. There is no purpose. And that is beautiful. Sharon once wrote that, to exist is to protest against nothingness. But maybe he was wrong. Maybe to exist is to become one with it. Not to fight the void, but to mirror it. To live without reason, like the void itself does. To be useless is not to oppose nothingness. It's to embody it consciously, tenderly. To love the emptiness instead of fearing it. Imagine this. You wake up one morning and for the first time you feel no urgency. The clock means nothing. The deadlines dissolve. The old voice whispering, "You should," goes quiet. You sit, you breathe, and you realize nothing needs to happen. The universe doesn't collapse. The world keeps spinning. The sun rises without your permission. The air doesn't charge you rent. For the first time, you are alive without agenda. That's freedom. From that silence, real joy can appear. Not the synthetic joy of achievement, but the effortless joy of existing. You laugh at the absurdity of it all, not with bitterness, but with tenderness. You see that even suffering has its place, that even despair is part of the useless beauty of the world. You no longer need to win against life because you've stopped seeing it as an opponent. This is what it means to do nothing, not to rot in apathy, but to rest in awareness. It's not escape, it's arrival. It's not defeat, it's lucidity. When you stop moving, you realize that stillness was never absence. It was the original state. The motion came later. The noise came later. The meaning came later. The stillness was always there, eternal, patient, watching everything pass. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You carry that stillness everywhere. You become slow in a world that worships speed, quiet in a world that rewards noise, useless in a world that measures everything. And yet, in that uselessness, you feel infinite. Comment below. Do you think stillness is weakness or the final form of strength? Subscribe for more forbidden philosophy. Thoughts meant not to motivate, but to wake you up. Like this if you've ever felt alive only in silence. Share this with someone who's afraid of doing nothing. Because the world runs on fear, but it stops when you stop.